Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our 3 and 30 this February, the Sensory Experience African Art. Our African art educator, Getty, who will be giving the 3 and 30 this morning. She gave it in person on Tuesday and will be giving it virtually today. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Karen. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Lulan and Jinyu. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. I'm really excited to be doing this 3 and 30. As Lulan mentioned, my name is Karen Getty. I am the African Gallery educator here at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. Hopefully everybody can see my screen okay. Okay, so today I am going to be focusing on the sensory experience of African art. And I've got a little setup I'm going to give here to kind of introduce everyone to this subject. African art it's a really complex subject. I know we just use the phrase African art all the time. There's really no such thing as one type of African art. It is there's so much variety in time period, in style, in material, in approach. I mean, so I want to, kind of introduce the kind of art I'm going to be talking about today. So really quick, today's gallery talk. First, we are going to highlight 3 objects that are in the African collection. We are going to celebrate Black History Month through our talk today. And this is also just a way for us to enjoy the African galleries before they go off view in April, which will be in preparation for our expansion project. So if you haven't heard that news yet, yes, enjoy the African galleries as much as you can over the next few months. We are going to be losing access to several gallery spaces as we near the expansion. Obviously, that has to be done in order to move some of these collections into the expanded wing, but also to protect them from rumblings during construction. So, now, the type of art I'm going to be focusing on today is what we call traditional or historical African art. So the art that I'm looking at typically comes from the time frame, what we refer to as pre-colonial to the colonial period, which is basically the 19th century, maybe late 18th century, 19th century into the early 20th. The majority of traditional or historical African art is functional. So often these objects, they're meant to be used, they're meant to be touched, danced, or worn, or in some cases, libations are poured over them. They were not intended to be static objects that we look at behind a glass. So they're very much out of their original context. And that's part of what I want to try to recreate for you all today. The most common types of traditional African art are typically masking, sculpture, jewelry, body adornment, metalwork. Some common themes that you'll see addressed in these objects typically relate to the life cycle, important points of our life. So whether that's birth, adulthood, illness or old age, or the spiritual realm or ancestors, those are typically the themes that are addressed in these objects. Um, Also, traditional African art, you'll notice as we go through today's talk, is categorized by cultural group. And that's different as opposed to, categorizing it by an individual artist or a nation or a country. So I'm going to explain why that is. So we're going to look at a map of Africa, which I do like to do whenever I talk about African art. And we see all of the political boundaries that are drawn up on this contemporary map of Africa. But it's important for us to remember that those lines don't necessarily reflect the cultural landscape that existed on the continent for thousands and thousands of years. So if we take a look back pre-colonial times, we can see like in many places all around the world, multi-ethnic empires and groups were born right around major river systems. So in the West, along the Niger River and its tributaries, we see all of these major empires that rose up along the Nile River, where Egypt and into Ethiopia. And then when you look at Central Africa, the Congo River and its tributaries and lakes. So we see these multi-ethnic empires empires kind of rising up around these major river systems. So these cultural groups and societies, civilizations were well in place for many, many years when the colonial period hit. And it's a time that a lot of people refer to as the scramble for Africa. European nations started to really catch wind of the amazing resources that were available on the continent, mineral resources, all sorts of natural resources, whether it be from animals like ivory tusks or rubber from a rubber tree or palm oil from the palm tree or, just all sorts of resources that were exploited. And during this time, there was something called the Berlin Conference in 1884. These two images here are kind of um, referencing that. During this conference, it was decided these European countries basically put the continent on a chopping block and drew up all of these boundaries and colonies, and that ultimately is what was a basis for the countries we see today. So these boundaries were laid down on top of those cultural groups that had been there for so many years. And what we see is in the map today, in the countries that exist today, in many cases, several cultural groups might be living in one country, or one cultural group might be split amongst several different countries. So that has caused a lot of issues. Needless to say, it is the reason why we see civil war in a lot of areas on the continent, as well as some political corruption. All of it stems from this history of colonization. So I don't have time to get into that right now, but I just want to make sure everybody understands that and why we categorize traditional African art the way we do, because it's reflective of those cultural groups, not the nation. Okay. Before I move into the art pieces, I just want you to remember that Africa is extremely diverse. There's roughly 54 independent nations on the continent, thousands of languages, or excuse me, over 2,000 cultural groups, thousands of different languages and dialects, different religions, different landscapes. I mean, it's just a very diverse place. Okay. Along the lines of our theme today, we're talking about sensory experiences. When we're looking at art, I don't think we often give all of our senses enough credit. We typically associate vision with the art viewing process. But in reality, we really do use a lot of our other senses, and we may not even be aware half the time. Well, it is especially true when we're talking about traditional African art. So many of these objects are, again, meant to be seen in certain contexts that affect the way you engage with the object, the way you come to know it. Certain smells can be associated with it, whether it's the pipe of the diviner or the smell of animals from a potential animal sacrifice that accompanies these ceremonies, or if it's the sounds of the drums and the music that you hear, or the taste of a specific tea or plant that might be specific to these ceremonies. So it's really important that you have to engage all the senses to understand these objects fully. So I'm going to start with this object, and I'm going to focus on the sense of taste. And you might be wondering, Karen, how can you relate taste to a door frame and lentil? Well, I'm going to explain. So first of all, this door frame, it comes to us from a cultural group called the Sogo. And this group is from Central Africa, specifically the country of Gabon, which is on the West Coast. And forgive me for the fuzzy map here. Every once in a while, I have a fuzzy image. Um, but this cultural group is associated with a belief system that's known as Bwiti, Bwiti. I've spelled it up here for you. And Bwiti is a system of beliefs. It's a moral philosophy around which the Sogo base a lot of their life practices. And this door frame and lintel, it's believed that it originally graced the front of a building called an Ibanza, which was a Bwiti house of ritual. I shouldn't say was, is a Bwiti house of ritual. This is still very much practiced today, this particular belief system. And actually, people from all over the world will travel to Central Africa to participate in some of these initiation ceremonies. So, central to Bwiti is a connection to the ancestral realm. That's actually going to be a thread that we see through all three of the objects today in our talk. So, a connection to the ancestors, but also a connection to the environment, to the land. Specifically, there's a plant that is very much key to Bwiti initiation rituals and ceremonies. It's called Tabernanthe iboga. And it's an evergreen rainforest shrub that's native to Central Africa. And the ingestion of this plant, eating this plant, consuming this plant is something that's central to the practice of Bwiti. It is medicinal. It's got a hallucinogen component to the plant. And like many, many other groups around the world, the way that these medicinal plants are discovered is through watching animals. So this is what the iboga plant looks like as a shrub or a flowering plant. But the way that the Sogo first discovered this medicinal quality was by watching warthogs. Like other around the world, a lot of medicine men and herbalists will watch nature, observe nature to kind of learn what where these potent substances are, where they can be found. So they would watch these warthogs root at the base of these shrubs and trees, and once they ate some of the roots, they would kind of run around in a wild frenzy. And so they determined that this was a potent substance, and it has been experimented with, and they've done a lot of studies and finally gotten it. They know a lot now about adequate doses and how much of the plant is safe and things like that. So this has become an intricate part of the Bwiti initiation ceremony. So I want to come back to the door panel, and I want everybody to really take a look at some of the visual, the iconography, the symbols, the colors that we see, faint colors on the door frame, are very symbolic. They relate to the life cycle. Um, and it's a life cycle that is, it's a, what is the word I'm trying to think of? It's a concept, the life cycle concept is something that we see. It's indicative of a lot of traditional African cultures, especially in Central Africa. The Congo people who are close to the Sogo also believe in a life cycle. They refer to it as the Dikenga, and it's 4 moments of the sun. It's dawn is birth, the east is wait, no, east is birth, sorry. And then it's noon is the height of life, the maturation, your adulthood. West is sunset, and that's the gateway to death. And then south is midnight. It's the realm of the ancestors. So yeah, so the life cycle concept is something that is practiced by a lot of traditional groups on the continent. And there are color codes that kind of identify those different points of the sun. So black, escaping obscurity through birth. Red is as you become an adult, filled with vitality. White, moving into older age, closer to the spiritual realm. Yellow, associated with the earth, which is when you return to where the ancestors dwell. So those colors are symbolic. The human figures that we see represented represent ancestors that are there to protect the building and those within. The diamond shapes represent canoes. Water and the passage over a river or a body of water is often associated with death and rebirth, passing from one side to another. And initiates that went through this process were symbolically said to die and be reborn into Bwiti, and it's kind of a way that they're born into adulthood. So they're as a child they die and they're reborn as adults ready to contribute to Sogo society. Also, a lot of these ceremonies are 3 days, and the iconography we see with the three suns at the top, and I put stars by them, and the two crescent moons at the bottom indicate that 3 day initiation. So 2 nights and 3 days. Iboga, again, would be something given to the initiate. It can be used as a stimulant, but also in larger doses, it does produce hallucinations. And it's a way to bring up an initiate to a higher state of consciousness, this enhanced self-awareness, being able to look within, but also to have communication with the ancestors. So these images, these fractal visions they must be having, it's interesting. It's like, are there visions coming from what we see there, or are these images a reflection of visions that people have had as they underwent the process? So I've got to keep moving, but oh, and here's an image showing, giving you an idea overnight what, these ceremonies might look like. And there is music, harps, drums, that's played, even if you do sleep throughout the process while you may be having some visions. The music continues as a way to continue to evoke the spirits and kind of guide your visions. So again, I could have done any sense with this. It's about sound, it's about, touch, and it's about vision, and it's about taste. So it's a lot of senses are involved in engaging with these objects. Okay. So the next object I wanted to move to, and I want to think about the sense of smell with this. This is another one that we could talk about any and all of our senses, but I want to think about smell as it relates to this object. Some of you may recognize this. This is actually a mask. A lot of people, when they first see it, don't know what to think it is. It's this abstract bundle of textiles, and but it is a mask. Typically, when we think of masks in this part of the world, we're typically thinking of a face covering, something that just, covers our face. But in Africa, especially among traditional African art, masks are usually meant to cover the entire body, meant to completely conceal the person underneath. And such is the case with this Egungun mask. Egungun masks come in all types of varieties. They are specific to the Yoruba, and the Yoruba is a really amazing, large, and complex cultural group. There are many subgroups among the Yoruba, and this cultural group is one of those groups that spreads into different countries. So Nigeria, mostly southwestern Nigeria, into the Republic of Benin and parts of Togo, as well as, the Yoruba people are a huge part of the African diaspora. And, there's a Yoruba community in South Carolina. There's a lot of communities in New Orleans, and a lot of their traditional or indigenous religious and divination practices are still practiced today all over the world. So a very prolific group. And these Egungun masks are said, Egungun translates as the living dead, which sounds kind of like zombie, but it essentially is what it sounds like. It is the return for a brief time of the ancestors. During these masquerades, ancestors are said to be present, and the person performing the mask becomes part and parcel of the overall costume. Their body, like the costume, is embodying that particular ancestor or spiritual persona. The dances range. In some cases, they're very acrobatic and violent and quick and jerked movements and a lot of swirling. And, often ancestral presence is associated with wind. And we'll see a lot of these whirling dances. The motion of fabrics will stir up dust, and it evokes the return of family spirits. Also, the breeze that might blow on the audience is said to be blessings from the spiritual realm. Um, so thinking about smell with masks. So for the person who's wearing this mask, there is a process that they would go through in order to prepare themselves to embody the spiritual persona. And oftentimes things like fresh basil or other fragrant plants, I just kind of put images of fragrant plants from West Africa. That's what I did here. And like this is an image of fresh basil. But I've read specifically that certain plants, specifically things like fresh basil, would often be used, put in these bundles and put on the inside of the mask to help activate the performer's senses and really help them engage with that spiritual persona. Sometimes they might be ingesting something that helps them connect with the spirit. Other times I've heard of, them going into trance, like going through a certain ritual that helps them get into a trance-like state to help them get in the right mindset, because it's a very intense, emotional, and sacred masquerade. Um, and, you know, again, here's another image of, you can kind of see the variety of these different Egungun masks. And they also, thinking about touch and the power of touch, these masks are considered so powerful, so potent, and also it is a mystery, right? They don't want people to know who's under the mask. It's part of the power of the mask. And even though the audience knows there's a human under there, it's still, there is this belief that that human body becomes part of the costume, embodying the spirit. So regardless of the fact that there's a body there, it's still the spirit for people, um, for the followers of traditional Yoruba culture. Okay, and anyhow, the power of these objects, a lot of these Egungun masks will have a minder or like a bodyguard with a big stick to kind of walk around and keep the audience away. I think they used to be more likely to hit you. I don't know how likely they are to do that now, but I think most people are pretty scared and keep their distance. Also, music sometimes warns you to keep your distance. So that's another way that sound will shape the way you engage with these objects in their original context. Um, the colored textiles are a metaphorical and a literal symbol of a family's lineage. They are renewed. These masks are renewed every year with new fabric strips. And that's something taken care of by the family of the ancestor being represented. So it's kind of, members of the family would be selected to kind of care for these objects, and it connects every generation through these fabric strips that'll be added each year. Also, this type of a gungun mask, it's a particular type. It's got this rectangular wooden board that gives it this rectangular shape, and that's what they attach the fabric strips to. Other decorations like cut aluminum, coins, buttons, and then you see the mesh panel that the performer would see out of. All right, y'all. I know I'm running short, but we might go a few minutes over 11:30, but this is my last object. And we're going to think about touch. Again, like I've said, any of these objects, we could easily relate them to any of the senses, but I'm trying to focus on one specific with each of these. Okay, so this is called a community in Kishi, and it is from the Songhay culture. Before we take a close look at the object, just as I have been introducing you to the cultural group that produced this piece, this is from the Songhay, and they're a large cultural group from Central Africa, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which is such a rich area with a very complex and tumultuous history. This location has been through so much, both the land and the people. The Songhay are just a really complex group, similar to the others we've discussed. They're known for masks and large sculptures. The one over here on the right is in our collection, and these two are just images from the field of other masks similar to ours, just to show you. But back to this object, as I mentioned, this is called a community in Kishi. And you may have heard the term in Kishi or in Kisi. That basically means power figure. So this is a power figure. And if a Songye person were to encounter this piece, they would be able to look at this and recognize that this represents a great ancestor from our past. It represents a chief, a leader from the past. And we're going to go through all of the iconography that kind of tells us that. Let's see. So, first of all, the horn that protrudes from the head, that actually it can be pulled out, and there is a large cavity that is in the head of this figure that tells us, that identifies this as a power figure because it would be packed with special activating substances. They refer to that as bishimba. It's just a variety. It could be animal parts, it could be medicines, it could be herbs, it could be different things. Uh, it could be literal things or it could be used for its literal uses or for its metaphorical use. So it's a variety of things that would be packed in. But this is a buffalo horn, which of course is an animal that's known as being very powerful. So that kind of is a symbol of a leader. Protruding from his forehead, you'll be able to see it better in another image I'll show you, but it's a hoe blade, which identifies this leader as possibly a great, farmer. Also, the brass tacks all over the face maybe connect the figure to the trade of being a blacksmith, possibly a hunter, to skill sets that were very much revered still to this day, positions that have a lot of power. A blacksmith can take natural ore from the earth, turn it into a liquid, and then transform it back into solid, into this usable thing. And that's kind of magical in a way, this ability to master that. Anyhow, moving back along the figure, the necklace that we see, that identifies, as well as the skirt. These are kind of identifiable of a leader, a great chief from the past. Also the stomach. I didn't note this in text. I kind of ran out of room, but he's kind of got his hands on his swollen abdomen, which could indicate this is a man of great wealth and status who was very healthy, ate well. Or we could think of it in a sense of a pregnant abdomen. And although he is a male figure, it's not uncommon for us to see female attributes given to male figures or vice versa, female objects having male attributes. That's a common theme we see in a lot of traditional African art, often because the marrying of these two types, there's a lot to be said for the differences between males and females, but when you combine their strengths, it really creates the perfect human. And so that's kind of what it's after. And by pointing to his pregnant stomach, it's kind of indicating that he's responsible for his lineage, and he's kind of the longevity of his descendants and that kind of thing. So all of these things make this figure identifiable as a community power figure representing a heroic chief from the past. Another thing that's really cool about this piece is we've recently been able to do some x-rays on it, which instead of disrupting and pulling it apart and things like that, they were able to run x-rays on it to see the internal cavities, and the discovered cavities not just in the head but also in the shoulders, the navel, and in the thighs. And packed within those cavities, there was a fine powder. They were able to take a small amount and test it and determined it's consistent with bone or cartilage, and they've identified it as animal. They think it might be bovine bone, like some kind of cattle or something. But they're still doing research on that. But just really cool that we can kind of learn some of this stuff. But all of these things make this object extremely potent. The reason I chose this is because it was so potent that it wouldn't be touched. You weren't supposed to touch it. Only the caretaker or guardian of this object who had special training was able to touch this. When it was being used and the way it would be used, this is a public power figure. It would be stored in a public building, locked up in the center of a community or village when it wasn't in use. But in use, they would use wooden rods to stick under the armhole here, and tied by raffia rope, they would transport it that way. So the rods would be tied to the rope and they would walk with it with suspended by these rods because it's so potent that you can't touch it. That's how powerful these objects are considered to be. There's different kinds of power figures. This is one that would have been used, it was for the entire community. And there are other types of Inkisi power figures that are more for the diviner and the client for a private divination session. So this one differs in that regard. And that really brings me to my end. I did not go too far over. And thank you all so much for listening to my talk. I hope that I've given you some insight into how sensory experiencing tradition African art can be.
Excellent. Well, thank you. And thank you to our visitors and audience who came today, and we will see you next month.